Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful worlds of psychology and mental wellbeing. This episode is a really interesting chat with Dr. Emma Bradshaw. Emma is a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Australian Catholic University and is a published author in a number of textbooks and academic journals. Her research focuses mainly on human motivation and our basic psychological needs, which, as you can anticipate, means that this episode is very applied given her topics are things that relate to every single one of us. Our conversation today focuses on the relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic life goals and psychological well-being. And given Emma published her thesis on this very topic, I feel she's very well versed to answer the questions I ask in this episode, such as, does money make us happy? And how can we escape the materialism trap? So, without further ado, here is my discussion with Dr. Emma Bradshaw. So, you obviously studied extrinsic and intrinsic aspirations and their relationship to psychological well-being in your thesis. So, I'm wondering kind of if there's a personal journey as to why you chose that as a topic to dedicate, 4 to 5 years of your hard work and blood, sweat and tears.
Yeah, I think that's a question worth posing to anybody who's done a PhD, actually, because for the most part, there's a kind of funny, like a tongue-in-cheek belief within the field that what you become expert in, what you dedicate your life to researching for a couple of years, is usually a reflection of what you struggle with. And so I wouldn't necessarily say I struggle with extrinsic goals and materialism, but I did spend, I'm in my late 30s. Academia is my third full-time profession. And that is because I spent my 20s doing other stuff that I thought would like look and sound cool to other people, but that I ultimately found not very rewarding. And so when I sought to explore correlates of well-being and the things that make people happy, I thought it's not what society tells you or what you think is going to look good to others that you will ultimately find rewarding or satisfying. For me, in the end, I was like, I asked myself the question of what is the true path to feeling happy if it isn't impressing other people. And so that's how I came to the study of intrinsic and extrinsic aspirations.
Right. So you had to go through that journey yourself in terms of...
Yeah, definitely. No, so when I was still at the beginning of a PhD, you tend to get a couple of months, if you're lucky, to just kind of ponder different ideas. And one of my supervisors, Rich Ryan, who's he's the creator of self-determination theory and still my boss now. I was saying, I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do. And he said, Emma, what are you passionate about? What questions do you really want the answer to? And I really wanted the answer to how you know what is good for you as compared to what media and society tell you is good for you. I wanted to explore that. And he was saying, well, I think goal contents theory is going to be right up your alley. And that's where I ended up.
Right. Okay. No, interesting personal journey there. And when you say goal contents theory and extrinsic and intrinsic aspirations, can you maybe give us a bit of a picture as to what they are and define that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Within self-determination theory, which is a broader theory of wellness and motivation and personality and development, there are 6 mini theories, and one of them is goal contents theory. And it refers to the what of the goals we pursue. So it's not so much about the energy that you put into your goals, whether you do or do not pursue them. It's about what they actually are. The theory holds that there is a selection of goals that are in and of themselves inherently satisfying and good for you, and other goals that may look and sound appealing and probably feel rewarding in a moment, but are inherently contingent on the approval and feedback of other people, and so don't have that inherent rewarding quality. So that is juxtaposing intrinsic aspirations, which are healthy and naturally need satisfying, with extrinsic aspirations, which are more materialistic and dependent upon the approval of others.
Okay. And in your thesis, you focused in particular on the kind of the consequences of having those extrinsic and intrinsic aspirations on psychological well-being, right?
That's right.
what are some of those costs and benefits of having more of an extrinsic or more of an intrinsic aspirational profile?
Good question. Well, it sounds like a simple question, but actually, within the theory and the evidence that supports it, it's the content certainly matters, but what matters in addition is how you prioritize goals of different types. What I mean by that is there's not necessarily anything bad per se about pursuing something materialistic, such as wealth or beauty. There's nothing in and of itself wrong with pursuing those goals. But if they end up taking the focus of your overall goals, your overall goals and drive over things like maintaining positive relationships with other people, contributing positively to community, growing and learning and developing new skills, if the materialistic goals crowd out those healthier intrinsic goals, the cost to your well-being is quite substantial. We've just published a meta-analysis looking at the last kind of 40 years of exploring this, 30 or 40 years of exploring this question, and found that about 25% of the variation in an individual's well-being is accounted for by the degree to which they prioritize intrinsic or extrinsic aspirations, meaning
Wow.
like a quarter of your well-being can be compromised if you're focusing on money and beauty and fame and power over caring and loving and growing.
Yeah. Okay. So it's more nuanced than it's more nuanced than saying that having extrinsic aspirations is bad for you, right? It's actually that ratio and as you said, the focus of extrinsic versus intrinsic. Is that right? That's more
Yes,
important for psychological well-being.
that is a super important point, because within this literature there has been something of a demonization of extrinsic goals in and of themselves, but it's entirely possible for you to pursue more materialistic extrinsic things for reasons that aren't necessarily bad. You might be pursuing wealth so that you can feel a sense of kind of security and stability in your everyday life. You might be pursuing a positive image so that you can maintain your sense of confidence and self-esteem. It's not that the pursuit of those goals shouldn't feature in an overall pattern of simultaneous life goals. It's just that they can't be allowed to crowd out things that are more naturally satisfying, or you will become dependent on feedback from other people as a response to your goal accomplishments, rather than actually
Mm.
experiencing the goals themselves as being rewarding.
Yeah, okay. I found that really surprising reading your paper, and if I'm honest,
Mm?
prior to that, thought that it would have been like a more just simply a case of a negative correlation
Mm.
between extrinsic aspirations and well-being. Was that the same for yourself before you went down the avenue of doing that thesis and that research?
Did I think that there'd be a negative correlation?
Yeah, and that it would be less nuanced than what you're saying it is in terms of the ratio, and just purely, more extrinsic aspirations you have, the worse your psychological well-being, irrespective of the ratio of intrinsic aspirations.
Yeah, at the time, I definitely was anti extrinsic and materialistic aspirations. I definitely thought they would be bad, but I have come to, and not just accept from an evidence based point of view, but qualitatively have a different understanding of the different functions of different goals. And I can
Mm.
see that there is some utility in striving for things that may on the surface look materialistic. I know that I've got some friends who are working really hard for money at the moment because they want to put money aside to send their kids to good schools, because they live in a not great area, so they're going to have to invest in good quality schools near where they live and stuff like
Mm.
that. So I can see that there is some utility in it, and that it's not all bad as I expected.
Mm. So, are there? It sounds like you're alluding to this anyway, but are there any contexts where having more extrinsic aspirations are better, or is it only when it's in order to achieve an intrinsic goal? For example, I know you want to buy a house in a particular area of Sydney to be close to family. For example, is that an example of perhaps when extrinsic aspirations could be useful for well-being?
So there's not actually been many good tests of when the context in which an extrinsic aspiration might be good. There have been, and there were some in the kind of mid noughties, some researchers theorized that what mattered was not so much the content of aspirations, but the degree to which the content of your life goals matched the values of the environment in which you found yourself. So, for example, they wondered if you were studying an MBA, if you were doing business and you were learning how to make businesses profitable and so on. They wondered if you were surrounded with people who had that similar value set and you were learning about that kind of stuff, would people in that environment actually be better off if they were striving extrinsically rather than intrinsically? And there's not actually been any support for that was called the match hypothesis. If there's a match between goals and environment, it was not found. What appears to matter is the degree to which a goal of any type, intrinsic or extrinsic, serves your basic psychological needs. So this is another element of self-determination theory. It falls within its own mini theory called basic psychological need theory. And it is the heart, I think, of self-determination theory in general, which holds and finds that human flourishing depends fundamentally upon feeling autonomous, so feeling volitional and like you are the author of your life and choices. You need to feel competent, so you need to feel capable and able, effective, and you need to feel relatedness. You need to feel connected to and cared for by other people. And so we have found that it is the degree of need satisfaction that a particular goal provides that dictates the extent to which it predicts or undermines well-being. So this is sort of different from your question about environment or context, but more about function. So you might be striving for, as I alluded before, perhaps you were born, an individual is born into low socioeconomic circumstances, and that places a lot of stress and pressure upon them. And as a result, they strive to, put every last penny into savings so that they can experience more confidence and ability in everyday life, more freedom to do as they choose with their time and their money, striving for wealth to serve those fundamental basic psychological needs would arguably be beneficial. On the flip side, it could also be possible for one to pursue something intrinsic, but for non-need satisfying reasons. And that would undermine the extent to which that, on the surface, positive goal might promote well-being. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. So maybe we'll check my understanding. So if the big question of, does money buy happiness? It sounds like the answer is it depends on what you're using that money for, and same with any other extrinsic aspiration. Is that right?
Within goal contents theory, it matters not so much how you have. It certainly matters why you're pursuing it, but it matters how that pursuit is kept in balance with stuff that is not extrinsic, that is not materialistic. So the question of does money buy happiness, I think, has been fairly conclusively answered at the objective level. It is one of the most misquoted studies ever, is the study that looked at the link between income and happiness. It is widely touted that at about $70,000 or $80,000, depending on the national currency that you're referring to, that at a certain point, gains in happiness cease. So if you're living below the poverty line, certainly earning more money will improve your well-being. But they say that at a certain point, 70 or 80,000, you cease to experience any additional gains in well-being with additional gains in wealth. It actually isn't true. It would probably, I know less of specific studies that look at upon which people spend their money. I'm thinking about it more in terms of what it would be reflecting in terms of need satisfaction and motivational quality if you were doing less productive things with it. I mean, if you're doing a Bill and Melinda Gates and earning just relentless cash and donating it, 95% of it to try and end poverty and disease in the world, my sense is they would gain a lot of well-being from the additional wealth that they gain, because they're using it to contribute so positively to reality. But if one were to be earning it and gambling it away, as an example, I would suggest that that would not be contributing to their well-being.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense, to be honest. Personally, in my own life, I remember it in my early 20s going out and buying a flash car. And a lot of it, to be honest, was, if I really reflect internally, was predicated on wanting to project an image of, I'm successful and whatnot.
Yes.
And I think that speaks perhaps to a lot of the reasons, we do acquire materials, is to perhaps, make up for inner insecurities and to project a certain image.
Absolutely. It's totally delicious to have external sources or external feedback on the quality of your personhood, on the quality of your being and success in reality. And some people believe that you need stuff in order to do that. And of course, by some people's definition, you do. I mean, it's something. It's like you may be familiar with the halo effect in psychology, that people of increasing degrees of success are thought by other people to be increasingly competent. They're more competent, they're more friendly, they're more likable, they're more good. And of course,
Right.
success is much easier to quantify to someone who, say, doesn't know you, if you can say, has a mansion, owns a fast car, owns a multi-million dollar business. These are objective indicators of quote unquote success that are easy to identify and therefore evaluate people upon. And the vast majority of people in society fall prey to it. If people have this list of good things, objective good things, they are quote unquote good.
And yeah, again, I can certainly speak to that, and it seems like it's everywhere, especially in Western society. Social media, TV ads, driving on the street, you see the Beamers and the Mercedes Benz and all that,
Yeah.
and we're subject to this, this influence of materialism everywhere we go. So how do we, and how do we escape that, or how do we deal with that so that we don't fall into that trap of thinking that buying and acquiring more materials is going to augment our well-being?
I think this is the next frontier of what materialism and goal content theory research needs to investigate. We know so far things that you can become aware of that are pressure, that could be pressures in the environment that might be leading to one's extrinsic aspirations. So in the context of SDT, we find that it's experiences of control and basic psychological need frustration. So if your experiences of autonomy and competence and relatedness are being actively undermined, so if people in your friendship circle are making you feel rejected, if you go to work and your boss makes you feel incompetent, or you come home and someone in the home life makes you feel like you're not contributing meaningfully to the family, or if you just have external pressures in your life that make you feel like you're not in charge, those kinds of things will undermine your need satisfaction. And so you'll seek supplementary things to make you feel like you're doing well.
Right.
And extrinsic aspirations are kind of it's not necessarily lazy. It's a natural default to want to look for stuff that on paper would make you feel good. It's probably would account to some degree for what you were saying before about kind of wanting to buy a fast car. But so it's that evidence really only suggests that you can bring mindfulness around, or awareness around, the pressures in your life that may be conducive to your orientation toward materialistic stuff. But there has been very little research, and in fact, I don't know of any research that has looked at what an individual can do in and of themselves to rein in their own materialistic strivings, other than, and this is more an intuitive deduction from that which is out there, is to kind of bring a sense of awareness around it. Will this bring me satisfaction? What's tricky is a lot of the time, the gaining of an extrinsic aspiration can actually be super sweet in the moment. You buy a fast car, you drive it around, you feel great. or you get a cosmetic procedure and you walk out of the beautician's office and you feel 10 times hotter than you did before you went in. But ultimately that stuff is ephemeral, and your fast car will eventually just become the mundane everyday car that you get in to get you from A to B. And whatever issue you had with the way you look will, aging is a natural degenerative process through which those of us who are lucky to age, or lucky enough to age, will all go through. So these problems, if you want to call it that, will rear their ugly heads once again. And when they do, when the car becomes boring, when your degree of beauty becomes a problem again, you don't have anything upon which to rely that will give you that consistent ongoing sense of security, which something like having learned a new skill or built a new relationship would be inherently satisfying and unlikely to have that same kind of expiry date.
So you mentioned mindfulness and awareness of those external pressures. Do you think as well it's like about going even deeper and perhaps doing the inner work as to dealing with those internal insecurities, whatever they are, and asking yourself, why is it that I do want that flash car? What is it that my self-esteem or my self-worth or whatever it is so heavily predicated on others' opinions of me?
Yeah, I would hazard a guess that a strategy like that would be effective. The longitudinal evidence, and there is not very much of it, that is out there in the goal contents theory field, has done less to get people to question why they strive extrinsically and more to encourage people to think about the benefits of striving intrinsically. So getting people to think about the benefits of orienting towards stuff that is more inherently satisfying and less materialistic, rather than considering why you orient towards things that are materialistic. But even if there's no evidence for it, I think it makes intuitive and practical sense that if one were to bring an awareness around why they're orienting toward materialistic stuff, if you can answer that question honestly within yourself, as I want money so that I can provide security for my family, or I want a certain degree of notoriety in my community, of fame in my community, so that I can. Politicians probably have fame aspirations, and some of them that's a function of power, and for others it's a function of wanting to make a positive change in the world. And so that's an example of how you might have an extrinsic aspiration, but it could be as a result of something that is very materialistic or can have intrinsic underpinnings.
So yeah, on that, right, on augmenting your level of intrinsic aspirations, what do some of those intrinsic aspirations look like? I think in a couple of examples you mentioned, the Bill and Melinda Gates donating to charity, but yeah, can you maybe color that in a little more as to what an intrinsic aspiration looks like and how one can, take steps towards augmenting that part of the ratio of extrinsic to intrinsic aspirations?
Well, I mean, the four prototypical intrinsic aspirations are personal growth, so strivings that one undertakes to learn and grow and develop within themselves. This is the kind of thing that a healthy organism, of which humans are one, should always be striving for, becoming better integrated with and more capable within the environment. Relationships is another one. So social connectedness is obviously tied to the basic psychological need for relatedness. So focusing on building not necessarily a volume of relationships, but relationships that are of a certain depth and quality. Contributing to the community. So this is, in some of the research that I've done, has been shown to be a particularly important node as far as well-being gains go. If you have a genuine aspiration to make the world a better place and you are working toward that, it tends to promote your well-being quite strongly as compared to other intrinsic aspirations. And then the fourth of the prototypical is the most controversial. It's physical health. And the reason it's controversial is because it has been shown psychometrically to be sometimes intrinsic and actually sometimes extrinsic. But I think that makes sense to me. I think Some people strive for physical health because they want longevity and they want to feel vital. Other people are striving for physical health because they want to be thin and maintain a certain body ideal. That said, though, being physically healthy is just intrinsically good for you. So I think that situates it as an intrinsic aspiration, just fundamentally, even if you are doing it for a more aesthetic or vain purpose. We've done some research in the last couple of years also at, quote, expanding the map of intrinsic aspirations, looking at whether there may be more intrinsic and extrinsic aspirations that might array together. And we found that things like self-expression, so the ability to kind of pursue one's interests, is obviously tied to autonomy and is an intrinsic aspiration. We also found something like mastery was an intrinsic aspiration, and it has natural links to competence satisfactions. But your question was whether oh, I had it on the tip of my tongue just then.
It was twofold, I suppose. It was what were the intrinsic aspirations,
Yes.
and also how can people implement that in their life?
Yes. So they are they're the prototypical examples, whatever those things would look like for you. But Bill and Melinda Gates are an example of what is a kind of, at the moment, underground but increasingly known movement called Earning to Give, which is from within. I don't know if you've heard of effective altruism.
I have, yeah.
You have, yeah, which is just, most effectively spending every dollar for the benefit of others. It calculates things like quality of life and evaluates the extent to which each dollar donated to, for example, charity is going to benefit the life of another. And people who are earning to give, rather than working for charities or getting jobs in government to result in positive change for people in the world, are instead getting hedge fund jobs and striving to donate a vast majority of their income, 50%, 80%, maintaining only 5%. And so that's an example of the interaction between intrinsic and extrinsic aspirations, how something that on the surface could look very extrinsic, becoming a hedge fund manager or a millionaire, has actually intrinsic underpinnings.
It reminds me of I'm not sure if you heard of William McCaskill's 80,000 hours concept. Yeah.
So I read Will McCaskill's book, Doing Good Better, I think, which is where was my introduction to effective altruism.
I haven't read that, but yeah, it might give it a crack. How do you then, having read that, having seen the examples of Bill and Melinda Gates and others, how do you implement those four kind of key intrinsic aspiration domains in your own life?
Oh, good. That's a good question. I mean, so I think I've never been asked that before. I am naturally personal growth oriented. I think I'd be crazy to be an academic and not be. Prioritizing relationships is something that I strove to really focus, like important relationships, I strove to really focus on after having spent 5 or 6 years working in magazine publishing. I found that I would focus on maintaining relationships that would result in promotion or feelings of popularity or feelings of coolness, and have since kind of recalibrated on the qualities of a good relationship and the things that you find genuinely rewarding. I luckily now live out in the mountains with my husband and a little baby, so I have very few opportunities to spend time with anyone who is a waste of my personal time. They're just good investments of my social engagement. I don't do as much as I would like to do in terms of community aspirations. I did, when I first learned about effective altruism, was donating money to at the time, it was the Against Malaria Foundation, was the most effective charity as rated by a foundation called Give Well, who evaluate different charities. So I was donating to the Against Malaria Foundation, but then I got into a PhD and I had no money, and so I really need to get back into doing something like that. And then physical health, I have to confess, I I might use the excuse that that's somewhat intrinsic and somewhat extrinsic to justify getting out of that. Particularly as a pregnant person, I've done far less
Mm.
physical activity than I would like. But I take vitamins and I try to care.
Yeah, it sounds like you've come full circle yourself right after doing this research, and made some really cool changes in your own life based off your research, which is awesome.
I reckon that the best way to be compelled by research is to give it a crack. And I have
Mm.
definitely found that focusing on things that are inherently satisfying is just the extent to which one is rewarding over the other is incomparable. Like I still like to buy, a nice piece of clothing, and I like to have savings in the bank and go on nice holidays and do stuff that is more materialistic. And it's not that I don't enjoy that stuff, but it
Mm.
does. There's not a percentage degree to which it's the same or even remotely comparable to what you get in terms of reward and enduring satisfaction from learning and growing and caring about people and focusing on those who matter.
In terms of people listening and them making changes, are there any like scales that you'd recommend or empirically validated measurements that people could use to ascertain their levels of or their ratio of intrinsic to extrinsic aspirations as it is now?
Yeah, you can Google just the aspiration index.
Hmm.
It's available on the self determination theory website. You may need to become a subscriber in order to access it, but that's very easy to do, and I highly recommend it anyway. It is generally not used as an individual metric in the evidence. For the most part, we're getting hundreds of people and we're talking about the average, but it will absolutely allow you to quantify a mean for extrinsic and a mean for intrinsic, and you can see which is higher.
Okay. Aspiration index. Is it?
The aspiration index, that's right.
Okay, cool. So I think finally then, Emma, are there any like websites or social media you're on if people did want to follow your research? Because it is such an interesting and applied topic, at least in my own humble opinion.
Thanks. Yes, well, I mean, I'm on all the things. So you can find me on Twitter at Emma L for Larry, Brads, and the same handle on Instagram as well. Instagram
Mhm.
is more personal, less scientific, and Twitter more psychologically focused.
Okay, awesome. Do you have any final comments or any kind of pieces of advice or guidance you wanted to give out to anyone listening?
I would never be so bold as to give advice, but I can, having spoken from my own experience, and I think I was already up on that soapbox a little bit. I I have found in my own experience irrefutable proof that focusing on stuff that is thought to be good for you is just ultimately more rewarding in an enduring way than focusing on stuff that's materialistic. It's incredible how if you manage to successfully let go of that, and the co-creator of this theory, so Rich, who's my supervisor, and Tim Kasser, who is an
Hmm.
American researcher, they did the original research on goal contents theory, and Tim is now basically off the grid and on a farm with goats, and he's very much ingested the non-materialistic lifestyle. I've not taken it that far, but I think he and I would both say that if you manage to ingest the values of goal contents theory, you'll ultimately be better off.